And as usual, we begin with the number of the day. Today, as you can see, that number is $1.9 billion US. That's how much was added to Ghana's economy last year because of an event called the Year of Return. According to their tourism minister, Barbara Otengiasi, in order to commemorate 400 years since the first enslaved Africans arrived in the United States, Ghana has marketed the country as a destination for African Americans to find their way home. They held a series of events, waived some visa costs and roped in some celebrities to encourage a lot more people to visit the country. So in December 2019, Beyonce, Ludacris, Boris Kodjoe, among other big American names, visited Ghana. People from the diaspora flocked there for music festivals, lounging on the beach, rediscovering their heritage and more of those activities. So those activities throughout the course of the year, because of course it wasn't just a 1 month thing, have brought in $1.9 billion to Ghana, according to their tourism minister, who was quoted on travel blog Travel Noir. So let's take a look back now at some economic data that's come out this week. Indebted consumers received welcome news when the Reserve Bank announced that they cut the repo rate by 25 basis points to 6.25%. The central bank revised downwards economic growth expectations for 2019 and 2020.
Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago this week called for urgent implementation of reforms that will turn the economy around. The Reserve Bank cut its economic growth expectation for 2019 from 0.5% to 0.4%. It now expects the economy to grow at 1.2% this year, down from 1.4% earlier. The impact of electricity supply constraints on economic activity remains a concern.
The country is waiting patiently to find out if any of these steps that the president has mentioned over the past few months in terms of addressing ESCOM are going to filter through, and we will have fewer rolling blackouts. We were told that we're not going to have blackouts, but what happened beginning of the year? It was back to stage 1 to probably 8 of the rolling blackouts. And I think that it's one area that remains the biggest Achilles tendon to the economy's growth. And I think that's why you're seeing ratings agencies, the World Bank, IMF, economists, and the central bank itself cutting the growth forecast for the country.
The mining sector continues to show signs of strain. Mining production contracted by 3.1% year-on-year in November, the fourth consecutive month of an annual decline. Economists expect the sector to continue to underperform on the back of power outages and the unfavorable policy environment. Retail trade sales accelerated more than expected in November. Stats SA data shows retail sales are up 2.6% year-on-year in November, following the 0.4% year-on-year in October. Economists say Black Friday boosted sales. The sector is not expected to continue the strong performance in the coming months as households are under pressure on the back of subdued income growth and a deterioration in consumer confidence. Stats SA will next week release the Consumer Price Index for December 2019, while the Reserve Bank is expected to release the leading indicator for November. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni will next week lead the South African delegation to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Mboweni says the country will communicate government's efforts to speed up structural reforms. Glura Sefako Musi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
The United Nations has warned that the world economy risks suffering a sharp slowdown in 2020, threatening international efforts to tackle the mounting climate emergency and poverty. The warning comes after US President Donald Trump signed the first phase of a new trade deal with China on Tuesday, easing a trade standoff between the world's two largest economic superpowers. This should help boost global GDP growth to around 2.5% this year. That's from a 10-year low of 2.3% in 2019. But the UN cautions that the potential for relapse remains high. So let's go back to the number of the day. I was speaking about that $1.9 billion that's set to have flowed into Ghana because of that year of return. I thought because it's a Friday, we can have a topic that's a bit more relaxed, that takes us back to perhaps some of the holidays that we've just gone on. I'm not joined on the line by Diallo Sambri. He joins me from Ghana. He's the founder of the Dinka Group, who works in that tourism space, more especially taking African Americans back to the continent. Diallo, thanks so much for your time on SABC News. Tell us a little bit more about what the Dinka Group does and what exactly that birthright journey is.
Well, thank you so much for having me. The Dinka Group is a African cultural resource company based out of Washington, D.C. in Ghana, West Africa. Birthright journeys are curated trips that we host for African Americans specifically to travel back to the African continent for a series of days of not just tourism, but really cultural immersion in reconnecting with brothers and sisters on the continent.
Mm. And what kind of costs are associated with this kind of tourism?
Well, it really depends. We know what the airline costs are. However, it depends on the level of accommodations that people are interested. Some people don't know that they have 5-star hotels in different parts of West Africa. So, if you want to stay at that level, you pay at that level, but the costs vary.
Okay. And how has it gotten easier, if in any way, to convince Americans in particular to come to the continent?
Well, we are a people sometimes that pay attention to the culture. And when we see one person doing it and another person doing it and another person doing it, we know it's okay. So what we like to say is we're shortening the distance to Africa. We also feel like that we're cleaning up the word Africa. It's been a dirty word for so long in the minds of so many African Americans because of the way the media has portrayed it. So we do see a lot more African Americans and Africans from the Caribbean and other parts of the world traveling to Africa.
Mm. So it's been said that more than 200,000 travelers are said to have arrived in Ghana in 2019. So while that's very good, and we've spoken about that quite large number, there has been a concern raised about foreign companies perhaps getting a lot of the money that could be going to local operators and enhancing their businesses there. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a concern, but I also think that a lot of foreign operators use and work with local businesses. So, I don't have the particular data and the stats, but I do think it's up to each tourism ministry to make sure that their local tour operators and that their local businesses are ready to receive the masses of people that are coming from the diaspora. More master classes on marketing, more master classes on service and hospitality. And I think that you'll see that number even out or balance out more. And I can't even say that foreign companies are doing most of the business. I don't have the data on that, so I don't want to say that I could support that as a fact.
Mm-hmm. So on the other hand, there's been comment that African tourist boards are not marketing their respective countries to markets such as the United States, to the Caribbean. What's been your experience about finding people from the continent in the different parts of the world actively selling their different countries?
Well, like I said, I think that the year of return has sparked something new. And I think you're going to see a rise in African Americans and Africans throughout the diaspora traveling to Africa. And I also think what you'll find is that the year of return has encouraged African countries to invest more in domestic tourism. So many Africans from different parts of Africa haven't been to so many parts of their own country to see and experience the beauty that many African Americans are coming to experience themselves.
Mm-hmm. So if we were to look at this kind of tourism that you're speaking about, immersing yourself in culture that's different perhaps to your own, what's next for this type of tourism, and can you give a dollar value to it?
It's kind of hard to see what's next because, Africa's a continent of 54 countries. So when you look at Ghana, naturally, you can see, I'm sure we're all watching the numbers in Ghana this year to see that they increase. And when you look at some of the other West African countries, there really needs to be more infrastructure before we could talk about having masses of people travel throughout the African continent. Every place is not like South Africa or as modern as some of the other parts. So it'll be really interesting to see what the next decade holds for tourism in Africa, and specifically African heritage tourism.
And then when you speak about the infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure are you speaking about that's going to enable that cultural tourism to grow?
Well, we're talking about everything from something as simple as making sure the roads are clear for ease of access to the specific locations. We're talking about the maintenance and the upkeep of the heritage tourism sites. We're talking about the training of the hospitality industry. So I think that there are a number of things that each country will look at closely to see how they can capitalize off of this tourism. I mean, the African American spending power is over $1 trillion, and we spend about over $1 billion in travel each year. So, I mean, I think it's definitely worth looking at.
Diallo Sambri, the founder of that Dinka Group, joining me on the line there from Accra, speaking about tourism, in particular African Americans traveling to the African continent. And with that, that brings us to the end of the bottom line. But before we go, let's take a look at what your market was doing at 5:05, according to information from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. The rand was trading at 14.45 to the dollar, and the euro trading at 16.04 to the rand. A barrel of Brent crude oil would cost $65.58. It's a very good evening from me. Let's take a look at the rest of the indicators.